Good afternoon, everyone. Good day. My name is Brecht de Vleeschouwer, and as the chair of the European Burden of Disease Network, I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar, where the colleagues of the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization will present us the joint estimates of the work-related burden of disease and injury. This is a hallmark project with a huge impact, and we are extremely happy for them to offer their time to present us what they have done and how they have done it. This webinar is part of the activities of the European Burden of Disease Network, a cost action which currently has more than 300 members from across Europe and beyond, and with an overall aim to integrate and strengthen capacity in burden of disease assessment across Europe and beyond. So being able to reach out to other organizations and colleagues who have worked on burden of disease is one of our key objectives. During today's webinar, we will have 4 different speakers from the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization, starting with Dr. Frank Bega, who is a technical officer in the Environment, Climate Change and Health Department at WHO Geneva. He is the one responsible for establishing and continuing to lead the WHO and ILO Joint Estimates, and has a background in epidemiology and health economics, so perfectly suited to conduct this work. Dr. Bega will start by welcoming you and providing you an overview of the joint estimates. Afterwards, we will have presentations by the colleagues covering the data sources, the methods, and the results. And we will conclude today's webinar with a session of the policy relevance and applicability for data users. During and especially after the webinar and presentations, we will have time for questions and answers. If you would have any questions for the speakers while they are talking, you can directly type them in the chat box. You can also raise your hand to ask the floor and ask your question directly. So with that, I want to give now the floor to Dr. Bega to introduce us to the program and to the remainder of the webinar. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you will enjoy this session today.
Thank you so much, Brecht, and all other colleagues who've been so kind to invite us to present this seminar to you on the new estimates of the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization of the work-related burden of disease and injury. I'm joined by my highly valuable colleagues, most valued colleagues, Dr. Natalie Moorman from WHO, and of course also Dr. Halim Hamzoui and Dr. Balint Nafradi from the International Labour Organization, and you will hear from all of us during this presentation. Can I just check, can you see the next slide, the overview of the session?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect, then we're on the roll. Colleagues, to provide an overview of what we're trying to present to you here of this session is, first of all, a welcome and a thanks again to our valued colleagues at the Burden of Disease Network for inviting us. And we will present an overview of the joint estimates up to this point, and this will be done by myself. We will then have a presentation of the data sources, some of the key data sources that we use by Dr. Nafradi. I will then talk about the methods that we used specifically, to hand over to Dr. Moorman to present results, and finally Dr. Hamzoui will outline some policy relevance, and I will talk about some of the products we've got on offer for use of these estimates within policy and research audiences. With this in mind, let me start to provide a bit of an overview of these innovative new estimates that are so precious to us. Well, the rationale for producing them was the following. In the past, the 2 UN organizations responsible for health, the specialist agencies for health and labor, WHO and ILO, have produced estimates of work-related disease burden in the past that weren't quite the same. And so we were asked by member states that we harmonize our estimates. That is very much in line with previous agreements that these 2 UN agencies, our UN agencies, have in place. Since 1948, in the WHO basic documents, we have an agreement with the ILO to share data and exchange evidence fully in line with these estimates. And as you will see later, we also have a dedicated collaboration agreement since 2019 to co-produce these WHO ILO joint estimates. Also, of course, we have to work as one UN. This requires us to work seamlessly across UN agencies, and this type of reform is really perfectly suited to produce these joint estimates. Moreover, the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda includes targets for environmental health and to ensure decent work. So this links the two organizations up perfectly, and there's a call for partnerships for development. So overall, this makes a very compelling case for these joint estimates and the two organizations joining hands. So what are the key objectives of this big initiative? Well, we set out, and this is about 6 years ago, we set out to develop a joint methodology, one methodology for estimating two metrics, typical burden of disease metrics, the number of work-related death and the number of disability-adjusted life years, or in short, DELIs. And how did we want to do this? We wanted to adopt existing methods that both organizations already shared for established peers of risk factors and health outcomes. And then we set out to also develop some exciting new methods for peers that hadn't previously been estimated, occupational risk factor and health outcome peers to that end. And really the ultimate objective was to produce the first ever joint estimates of the work-related burden of disease and injury to that end. Here's a bit of information on the organizational structure, if we can so say. There are two partnering organizations, WHO and ILO in light blue here, but we also have a number of supporting organizations that support this agenda, support these estimates. This includes NILE, which is a national workers' compensation department under the Ministry of Social Policy in Italy, but also the African Union, the European Commission, and the International Commission on Occupational Health, which is an organization that WHO has in formal relationships with, an NGO in formal relations with WHO, and that also has various relations with the ILO. In addition to this, we're also supported by a large number of individual experts, and this is arguably the biggest expert involvement in occupational health at the UN level that we are aware of. On the next slide, you can see where our experts, the experts that we've been working with, and many of you might be online today, where they're located. In total, we work with 230 individual experts that are in 35 countries. You can see here in blue are countries where individual experts are based that we are working with, and in gray those where we do not have representation and where we seek to fill over time the representation. And you can also see mapped here, I also have for you the government departments that we're working with. So you can see we have a number of ministries of health and labor and national offices for occupational health and safety basically in all the regions except for the Eastern Mediterranean region that we're working with. To finish off this overview, here's a timeline on how this all came to be. So in 2016, I remember clearly the first meeting where WHO and ILO, when we decided that we would embark on these joint estimates. It was very historic. It was at the ILO headquarters in Geneva, and we basically struck the deal to join hands as requested by our member states. Then we had a phase of 5 years where we basically developed our estimation strategy, where we systematically got our input data together so that we would have these data available for modeling, and where we developed our final models and produced the estimates. In between, I wanted to highlight some of the key points for these important estimates. Well, in 2019, and this is what you can see a photo on the top right here, in 2019, the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization and the ILO Deputy Director General signed our collaboration agreement for a long-term joint monitoring program with the WHO-ILO Joint Estimates. So a very exciting day. I remember sitting in this office and looking at this, and the people who are now in the photo, and it was a very nice day. In 2019, also, the World Health Organization recognized the WHO-ILO Joint Estimates for the first time as a public global health good, right? So a very small selected number of key products at the global level that the World Health Organization produced, in this case, with our valued partner, the International Labour Organization. Also in 2020, it's important to note that the World Health Organization consulted its 194 member states on our set of estimates, right? So every Ministry of Health, every Minister of Health indeed, and almost every Ministry of Foreign Affairs for all countries were basically invited to comment, receive these estimates, and were invited to comment on them and provide feedback. And in the same year also, the International Labour Organization consulted its other constituents, which are the workers and employers associations. So in 2021, and this is what we'll present to you today, the Director Generals of the World Health Organization and ILO co-launched the first cycle of the joint estimates. As I said, exciting to present to you today. And there are some plans for the second estimation cycle to be released in the not too far distant future. And with this, I have the pleasure to hand over to Dr. Nafradi.
Thank you, Frank, and welcome everyone in this webinar. I am Bálint Nafradi from the Labor Inspection, Labor Administration, and Occupation Safety and Health branch of the International Labour Organization, or ILO in Geneva. And I will start off with probably the least interesting, but still a fundamental part of making the estimates, the data sources, because clearly without data, we can't really make estimates. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I start the easy to access, or if like open access part of the data sources we used. Frank will talk in more details in the coming minutes of the details of the estimates here, but it's important that a fundamental block for our estimation is a cohort which is defined by sex, a country, obviously a age group which is 5 years old, wide and starts from 15 years old as a working population. So we have to align data which contains all these informations. Obviously, we need the number of persons we do the estimation for. So the populations are coming from the UN population prospective estimates. We have the global health estimates, the 2016 version from WHO, which contains the health outcomes, case-specific number of deaths or number of deaths for each of our cohort and each of the health outcomes we are dealing with. And as Frank will mention later on, and already did so, there are some established pairs, 39 of those, for which we sourced from the Health Data Exchange web platform directly the population attributable fractions. But we have 41 pairs, so there are still 2 more pairs we are missing data for, and that's coming in the next slides, please. Thanks. So these 2 last pairs, you will hear more in later, but the common for them is that they related to exposure to working more than 55 hours a week. And for this, we had to produce new databases, which were not existing before. The first is the WHO Global Working Hours Database. So this contains the exposure, the evidence for exposure. And this is compiled based on microdata, which was shared by ILO member states. And we use over 2,300 large-scale surveys. They're mostly labor force surveys and other probabilistic household surveys to compile the database. And in total, they contain more than 460 million individual survey responses for over 150 countries. And again, this database has disaggregation based on the requirements we will need for the estimation. The next slide, please. The other database related still to long working hours, which you have to compile, is containing transition probabilities in and out from our exposure category. And this made from a subset of these labor force surveys, which consist the cross-sectional database, those where we were able to track changes of the exposure for individuals over a period of time or consecutive years. The next slide. please. Thank you. So to give all this huge number of data in a map, you see by color here the countries where we have data, the gray ones, the gray regions where we were not able to get a labor force survey which contains all this information, and the color corresponds to the number of surveys integrated over the period of time we looked at for each country. Basically, you see it's a rather good coverage for the entire Earth. We have, as I mentioned, over 150 countries covered. Next, please. Thank you. So these are figures showing a different aspect of the database. On each of the figures, the X scale is year, and then you probably can't really read in this one, but these are the countries for each of the WHO regions we have data for. The color again represents the number of surveys we have for each of the country. What is interesting here is probably that we have most data clearly for Europe, and also really good coverage for the Southeast Asian region. But what's a specificity of Europe and some American countries, that there we have a luxury of having even parallel running surveys for each year when we could have a source for multiple surveys. For the next, please. And basically the same information provided here in our table, if you like, the numbers more than the figures. As I mentioned, what you see is that a big fraction of in total numbers of the surveys coming from Europe, but as a coverage per region, the Southeast Asian region which is relatively small in terms of countries in the region, but almost all provided data for the surveys. And I think with this, I will hand over to Frank for the more interesting part of the talks. Thank you.
Oh no, if I can disagree, this is extremely interesting. Thank you very much, Balint. Let's now move on to the methods part, which we've summarized for you colleagues in a technical report with data sources and methods. So that actually also the information on data that Balint has just presented, you can also find it all in detail here. And this is the cover of this report that you will find. If you Google WHO ILO Joint Estimates, this will be some of the first publications that pop up. So you can access it from our website. So now, what do we do to produce these estimates? Well, we use the Global Comparative Risk Assessment, which many of you will be highly familiar with. So this is a method or framework really established by the World Health Organization with Harvard University and the World Bank over 20 years ago, and has been used for that time to produce estimates and indicators by us and our partners. What we're doing here is we're trying to quantify the burden of disease at the level of the population as it is caused by specific occupational risk factor. In our case, where we look at work-related burden of disease, this will be very familiar to many of you because that's become sort of the dominant paradigm in burden of disease work. And we want to make sure that this risk assessment is comparative in the way that we always use the same definition and the same statistical and epidemiological frameworks. We almost always use the same methods for combining exposure data with the crucial information and risk information, the crucial risk information. So you will soon see the other databases that we've created are of our relative risks, right? You will see the systematic reviews we conducted and the meta-analyses of so many surveys and so many studies to get to the relative risks. And then with comparativity, we also make sure that we always use the same metrics to express results. And in other words, here, this is the number of deaths and the number of deaths. We also ensure that our risk assessment is consistent and that we always link disease burden by both disease and by risk factor. So we can split the pie as we wish, right? We can disaggregate by diseases or by risk factors or by both. I should also mention that for the joint estimates of WHO and ILO, we estimate the attributable burden. So basically, this is the burden for a specific estimation year from exposure that occurred in the past. And also crucial, we have numbers of cases of occupational diseases and injuries reported, from various sources where this information comes into WHO or the ILO, and we always work back with our estimates to see if this links up with these reported cases. Here's a graphical representation of this exposure-based method for burden of disease. So, excuse me, colleagues, on the left side, you see at the very top, we need two key input data sets. One is information on the risk factor distribution in the population, and Balint has just presented to you one of the databases on long working hours, specifically where we had this. And then we need information on the effect of the risk factor on the health outcome. So these crucial relative risks are epidemiological information on how much more likely is an exposed person to be dying or to have a specific disease compared to an unexposed population. When we have these two ingredients, we can basically combine them mathematically to calculate what is called population attributable fractions. Many of you will be familiar with this, but in lay terms, that's the fraction of all death or disease from a specific health outcome, from a specific cause, that can be attributed to this specific risk factor of interest, right? So once we have this fraction, if we multiply this with the total disease burden envelope, which we get from the WHO estimates, then we basically get the attributable burden of disease for a specific health outcome and a specific risk factor. So very common and established method. And colleagues, here you can see now the list of all the peers that we basically produced WHO ILO official estimates for. Balint has kindly already flagged that there are 39 established peers and 2 additional peers, right? So here you see the established peers in blue. On the next slide, you'll see the ones in red appearing that are new. But to just give a brief overview, we have a large number of risk factors that are occupational carcinogens and their cancer outcomes, right? So carcinogens, cancer outcomes. You can see here asbestos, arsenic, benzene, and so on and so forth. These are 18. Then we have a number of very important occupational risk factors that cannot be further grouped, but you can see here occupational asthmagens, occupational air pollution, and this is actually indoor air pollution at the workplace, occupational noise, ergonomic risk factors. That creates another group of peers. And then we have our occupational injuries, right? Strangely called occupational injury as a risk factor, with the various injury outcomes that you can see on the right. But importantly, now here in red are the new estimates that we've produced. These are on long working hours and ischemic heart disease and stroke respectively, and we'll be going into much detail, including Natalie, Dr. Moorman, in her presentation. Here's another quick reminder of the databases. So we have a number of databases. Balint has already presented information on the database on exposure to long working hours that we've built up, but we also have joint databases on industrial sector, which those of you who work in occupational burden of disease now is often used as a proxy for exposure to occupational risk factors. And similarly, we also have a database on occupations, which is also furnished with National Statistics Office data, exactly as we've heard from Balint before. In addition to this, through our systematic reviews, which I will present in a second, we started to build up direct exposure measurements on occupational exposure to ergonomic risk factors, dusts and fibers, solar ultraviolet radiation, occupational noise. From what we understand, this is something very new. Like basically here we're doing systematic review of prevalence studies, and we had to even develop some specific methodological tools for systematic reviews of this, which we will talk about in a second. So you can see sort of a broad range of different databases. And in addition, of course, we have our relative risk databases. For the UN, it's key that we follow the Sustainable Development Agenda of leaving no one behind. This means that we produce information on trends over time so we can see where the situation, health loss is reducing over time, which we'd be happy about, but also the alarm where it doesn't improve. And also we provide disaggregation. We provide all of our estimates broken down by country, region, and for the global level. And also, in addition to that, by risk factor, by disease, and by sex and age groups. So this is hugely important for identifying issues of health equity. There are also a number of quality assurance points in place at WHO that I want to mention specifically for any of our official health estimates. We have a very strong set of ethics management tools to make sure that interests do not influence our estimates. We also have a number of statistical clearance processes that we need to go through for every single estimate. So the evidence base must have been assessed as sufficient by us, by the Secretariat. And we have a specific guideline that we've developed with colleagues. It's called the Guideline for Accurate and Transparent Health Estimates Reporting, GARTHA, that requires us to systematically collect input data, to document our input data carefully, including to provide the metadata and provide descriptions of statistical models and uncertainty ranges. Many of you will be familiar with this. And of course, WHO estimates have to comply with this. All of these steps and all of these processes are checked by a department outside of the department Natalie and myself work on, Dr. Moon and myself work in. So this is our data analysis and delivery department that gives formal statistical clearance to any estimates before they can possibly be published. And I've talked before about the specificity of conducting country consultation. So WHO, for all estimates that we produce, always consults the ministries of health of all of our member states. These are 194. As I mentioned before, this includes consultation with the Minister of Health and the permanent missions being contacted and their feedback being invited by our Director General, Dr. Tedros. And of course, this helps us make sure that our estimates are, have country participation and are supported and used well within countries, which is our ultimate goal. A very quick reference to the systematic reviews and meta-analysis we conducted. So as we heard before from Barland, there are 39 established peers, and Berlin's already highlighted that these we can produce relatively quickly. We take the burden of disease 2017 study population triple fractions and multiply them with the WHO burden of disease for the years that we need. But for the additional peers, you will remember that we need the data from ILO, Eurostat, and WHO from member states. Then we also need systematic review data with the relative risks, right? The second part of this graph that I showed you. And then also we need the burden of disease envelope again. So for these systematic reviews, if you're interested in them, here's a paper that we wrote about them in Environment International, one of the key journals looking at environmental and occupational health systematic reviews. Basically, we conducted a large number, 15 systematic reviews that reviewed the evidence base for these additional pairs, for a number of additional pairs of occupational risk factors and health outcomes that we thought we could potentially produce estimates for. This was conducted by 200 individual experts in 35 countries by both organizations. We even had some national systematic reviews conducted by governments themselves, including the People's Republic of China and Thailand, which have been published independently. And we have a special issue where we present all of these systematic reviews in a journal called Environment International, which is edited by Drs. Paul Whaley and Tim Driscoll, which you can also find on the WHO website. Here's just, it's probably too small for you to read, but here are all 15 systematic reviews, and you can see these cover a broad range of different occupational risk factors and health outcomes. You can also see that all of these have been conducted with a protocol that was pre-published, right? So an additional step of transparency. And you can see here that they've basically generated today, I think, about 25 different papers that you can all access from our website. Here are the websites of the journal with the special issue on the systematic reviews, right? It's sort of quite exciting to have systematic reviews specifically for burden of disease estimates. And here on the right side, you can also see the latest systematic review published as a WHO report with the latest methods used in sort of the state-of-art standards that we have applied. I also mentioned that we had to produce some new methods for systematic reviewing of occupational prevalence studies. And here you can see some of these. We had to produce a tool for assessing risk of bias in studies of prevalence of exposure to occupational risk factors, which we then also pilot tested and then eventually did a full assessment of its performance. And you can see the two papers at the bottom here with the tool itself and then an assessment of how well it performed. And we've also just published, it's actually in press, a new approach for assessing quality of evidence of prevalence studies in occupational health, right? So we were basically forced to do these because there were no previous established methods to do this type of systematic reviewing of input data. And with this, I have the pleasure to hand over to Dr. Moorman.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all. I will now provide a short summary of the results that have been published so far for the WHO-ILO Joint Estimates. Next slide, please. So I'll start with the burden of disease attributable to exposure to long working hours, so from the two new pairs. And on the next slide, you'll see that two publications. So for each of these pairs, a systematic review and meta-analysis was carried out with a group of individual experts, and both were published in Environment International in 2020. One of the reviews focused on exposure to long working hours and stroke, and one on long working hours and ischemic heart disease. And on the next slide, please. This table shows that these reviews looked at 3 levels of long working hours, and they concluded that for each of the 2 outcomes, there was an inadequate or limited evidence of harmfulness associated with exposure to working 41 to 48 hours a week or 49 to 54 hours a week. However, there was sufficient evidence of harmfulness rated according to the navigation guide for working at least 55 hours per week. So these are the 2 rows that are highlighted in red. So for ischemic heart disease, the evidence came from 22 studies of over 300,000 participants, and it was rated as being moderate quality. The pooled relative risk suggested a 17% increased risk of ischemic heart disease among those who have been exposed to working at least 55 hours a week. For stroke, at the bottom, the evidence came from 7 studies of over 160,000 participants. And again, it was of moderate quality. And the pooled relative risk suggested an increased risk of stroke of 35% in those who had been exposed to working at least 55 hours per week. So for both outcomes, the evidence was then judged to be sufficient to proceed to estimation for the burden of disease associated with the exposure to working 55 hours per week or more. Next slide, please. So in May last year, we published this paper in Environment International presenting the estimates related to these 2 pairs. And on the next slide, we have some of the key findings. So we estimated that in 2016, 488 million people, or 9% of the working age population, were exposed to working at least 55 hours per week. And long working hours was attributable for 398,000 deaths from stroke and 347,000 deaths from ischemic heart disease. So in total, almost 750,000 in 2016. And it also led to 23 million disability adjusted life years. Next slide, please. So we found that there was an upward trend in both exposure and in burden of disease between the year 2000 and the year 2016. So for ischemic heart disease attributable to long working hours, there was an increase of 42%, and stroke attributable to long working hours increased by 19%. And we observed that the burden was larger in the WHO regions of Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Western Pacific, and also that it was larger among males and among older people. So one of the key messages from the paper is that the exposure to long working hours is occupational risk factor with the largest mortality burden identified, and this had not previously been quantified. So this was quite new. And then the next slide shows a map. It shows how the burden is spread across the world. So the combined rate of deaths from both stroke and ischemic heart disease attributable to long working hours. So here you can see the higher death rates in darker blue, often in the countries in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Okay, and then if you can move to the next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the burden of disease attributable to all of the 19 occupational risk factors that we looked at. On the next slide, you can see a picture of the Global Monitoring Report on the left, which was like the twin report to the technical report that Frank flashed up earlier. This was published in September last year, and it provided the estimates of the burden of disease from the 19 occupational risk factors that Frank showed in the table earlier. And shortly after this, we published a discussion paper in the Scandinavian Journal of Work and Environmental Health, which provides a summary of the two reports. You can move to the next slide, please. We estimated that almost 2 million deaths occurred in 2016 that were attributable to the 19 occupational risk factors, and 80% of these were due to diseases and 20% were due to deaths, as the infographic on the right shows. And there were also almost 90 million disability adjusted life years. And again, we saw a larger burden in the WHO regions of Africa, Southeast Asia, the Western Pacific, and among males and older people. On the next slide, there's a graph which shows the number of deaths broken down by occupational risk factor. So here we can see, this is taken from our report, we can see that the exposure to long working hours, occupational particulate matter, gases and fumes, occupational injuries, and occupational exposure to asbestos. These are the risk factors linked to the largest number of deaths. And on the next slide, we have the deaths broken down by health outcome. So we can see diseases at the top and injuries on the bottom half. And the main causes of death were chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, stroke, ischemic heart disease, and trachea, bronchus, and lung cancers. And then my final slide is, again, a map showing the worldwide picture for deaths attributable to all of the 19 occupational risk factors. So again, here indicating higher rates of death in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. So that completes my summary of the results, but this is just a summary, and if you want more detail, like for example the disaggregated results, you can refer to our reports, our journal articles on the estimates, and also our website. Thank you.
Lovely, and with this, we're now coming to the last presentation. We're perfectly on time, I think. So this will be talking about policy relevance and applicability for data users. And Halim, I have the pleasure, Dr. Hamzawi, to hand over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you to the organizers and the participants to be with us today. The next, please, Frank. So I will speak about the importance of this data in occupational health, and the data mainly that was furnished by the joint estimates, and comparing them to the other sources or other standard sources of data. Is it okay? Okay. So as you know, and according to ILO standards, but also to the principle of occupational safety and health management systems, when you have to implement or to promote a system of occupational health, you have first to identify your priorities. Once these priorities are identified between all the challenges that you are facing in terms of occupational risks management, you have to implement specific or adequate actions that may lead to the reduction or the suppression of this occupational risk. And then you have to assess your achievement. And once again, this is on a periodic manner, and you have then to re-identify your priorities and go on a continuous improvement approach. Next, Frank. So where are occupational safety and health data important? They are important at the three steps of this process. Now, the previous, please.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah. So when identifying your priorities, so you need data to define which risks lead to the most important damages in terms of health mainly, but also in terms of security and of safety. So at national level, for example, this is very important when performing the national OSH profile, which define the diagnosis of the current situation, and when this the other sources of data are lacking. So here you have the importance of joint estimates to perform and to identify disparities. As an example, last year we performed with Somalian constituents the occupational safety and health profile for Somalia, and as you know, in Somalia, the system of occupational safety and health is reduced to its minimum, and they are not able to produce other data, and so the use of WHO ILO Joint Estimates data was fundamental to define the priorities for Somalia, the same also for the Democratic Republic of Congo and for a number of countries where we have a lack of system of notification or where we have difficulties to perform other surveys like the workforce surveys. Then when you implement the adequate actions, so when you have at periodic intervals this data, you can measure the accomplishment of your goals and the advance you get in your prevention system, and then also to assess the achievement, as this process is a result-based management process. So you have to define your your baseline and your target and measure if you succeed to reach your target, or if other factors or other intervenants lead to this misachievement. Next. So the WHO ILO Joint Estimate offer an added value to other standards methods to produce occupational safety and health data. So we have the most standard is the notification and recording of occupational injuries and disease, and this is the source of data that is recommended, or this is the source of data that we recommend to use through our ILO standards, and mainly the protocol 155. But this approach will allow to workers to access to their rights, because when they notify and when they declare their injuries and their disease, so they have access to compensation. But the main difficulty is that there is great underdiagnosis mainly over occupational diseases for several factors, including the coverage of the system, the link that was made by the occupational physician or by the medical physician between the exposure and the occurrence of the health effect. The second is the complementary surveys that were associated or that we associate to level 4 survey or to establishment survey. So this allows us to explore all the development of injuries or disease, also that may explore also the exposure to occupational hazards. But here you are on questioning mode to workers, and you can get subjective responses specifically for work-related disease, as we can we haven't specific parameters or specific criteria to define which disease and what's work-related disease. So that's why our two organizations push and succeed to develop this WHO ILO Joint Estimates, which is an evidence-based data based on a validated methodology that is recognized by the scientific community, but also that give reliable data available by country, by gender, and by age, and this allow to target specific population and to optimize the use of financial and human resources for the prevention. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Halim. Colleagues, I will now finish us off. In the remaining minutes, we have to talk about the products that users could access from our estimates. So there are a number of data products and publications that you might be interested in. First of all, we have an online application that you can access from the website I give there, where basically you can visualize all of the estimates for each of the single risk factor health outcome pairs. You can see the map here, so you can basically create your own map. You can also explore in a second subset of this app inequalities between different disaggregation variables, right? So you can see these sunshine graphs. I think they're called sun ray graphs. But also importantly, you can download every single estimate that you want, right? So if you're in a government department, in the Ministry of Labor or Ministry of Health, you can go to the website and basically get, for your specific country, the exact estimates that you're interested in, right? Broken down by sex, by age group, and so on for each single individual peer. So these must be several 100,000 estimates that you can download. In addition to this, we do a number of indicator works for monitoring systems. So we're integrating these estimates into the WHO monitoring systems for global health, which is called the Global Health Observatory, our main data access stop for WHO, but also environmental health profiles that we bring out. And of course, ILO stat, I understand, are also being used. So this is the ILO portal for ILO statistics to eventually upload these estimates. And also we've worked with some external partners for their monitoring system to be populated with these estimates. We've highlighted the various reports that we have put out. You can see here on the right, again, the three main reports. These are the monitoring report with all the estimates, the technical report with data and methods fully reported, and then our systematic review on occupational exposure to solar ultraviolet radiation. And you can see here also 22 journal articles on estimates, the systematic review protocols. Actually, I think by now it's a few more, and our systematic reviews and methods articles. All of this is accessible from our website. You can see here also there are a number of communication and advocacy products. So again, the website is sort of the key entry point, but we have a number of media releases. We always do press conferences, and you can see here Dr. Tedros at one of the press conferences, our director, Dr. Maria Nader, and Professor Jian Li, who was one of the contributing experts at these press conferences. We also put out infographics through social media, and you can download these infographics if you want to use them. And we get a huge media response, like tens of thousands of people share these. And we also have produced some social media tiles with comments from the experts we've been working with on the estimates. And here's some of the outcomes of this sort of media and communication work. So when we released the long working hour estimates, they became breaking news, something that for occupational health doesn't happen so often. But I remember typing into Twitter long, and when I typed in long, I completed long working hours because there was so much. Twitter was sort of on fire on long working hours and our estimates. And here you can see BBC covered it, Le Monde, Forbes, the Japan Time, CNN, and so on and so forth. So several thousand newspaper articles were recorded by WHO Media Analytics when these estimates were released. Also, we've been really working with experts to build global understanding and capacity, first for evidence synthesis in occupational health and occupational burden of disease. As I mentioned before, we've worked with 200 individual experts in 35 countries who've been fully trained in how to do systematic reviews for burden of disease studies. This is something that certainly was not there before. We've also developed a number of working groups of experts, of individual experts, including one that with whom we work to improve systematic review methods in occupational health and burden of disease estimation. And we've developed a number of new methodological tools for synthesizing evidence on occupational exposure prevalence studies that I mentioned before. So sort of a huge enterprise in building capacity, our own capacity, and the capacity of people in countries to conduct evidence synthesis in this domain. And we've also built capacity on estimates for work-related exposures and burden of disease. This has included a large number of consultations with countries and their participation of the various government departments you saw outlined before. And for each of our estimates, WHO has a policy of working with technical advisory groups of individual experts to make sure these are fully in line and supported by the global scientific community. A very quick mention of what could be potential future scenarios for the estimates. We have a second estimation cycle in the making, where we also have some exciting new peers being produced. There could also be economic estimates added to the burden of disease estimates. It's possible to do analysis of geospatial distribution of both exposure and disease burden. So this leads towards subnational estimates, but also geolocating some of the exposures and diseases, such as, for example, heat stress or air pollution. And also, of course, this is important for many government departments. They ask us, could you project how much burden of disease we could reduce if we implemented certain policies and interventions? And these estimates certainly make this possible at the global, regional, and national level. So it's exactly 50 minutes my colleagues and I have spent, which I think was our aim. Here are final conclusions. So the two organizations responsible at the UN for labor and health have now launched our first joint estimates that are available for use in countries. As a first key conclusion, these estimates are based on very established statistical modeling methods. We've conducted systematic reviews of evidence, the largest set of systematic reviews for this type of burden of disease study. We have huge databases, as Dr. Nafradin Espalent has highlighted. These are primarily and almost exclusively official data, right? So these are from countries. And we have made massive efforts that these estimates are consulted by countries, with countries, and that countries are involved in producing them. Also, I recall what Dr. Natalie mentioned. We produced the world's first estimates of disease burden from exposure to long working hours. And it's actually remarkable, and for an epidemiologist like myself, it's mind-blowing that in 2021, we identified the biggest occupational risk factor, right? So it's quite remarkable, with 745,000 deaths estimated globally per year. We started our second estimation cycle where new pairs are upcoming, and I've highlighted just the various additional data and analytical products that we can produce in the future in addition to updating these estimates. And for this, of course, we look forward to having providing continued opportunities for collaboration with government, supporting organization, but also, of course, individual experts in the future in this monitoring and research domain at WHO and ILO. With this in mind, I just quickly note the funding agencies that have generously given to make this happen: Spain, Germany, the USA, and also the European Commission. And here's a large number of people who I'd like to acknowledge who've been involved in the production of the estimates and their dissemination at various levels. Here are the references for any of you that are interested in. I think this is basically the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Brecht.
Yes, that's excellent. Thanks a lot, Frank and colleagues. And congratulations once again on this impressive amount of work and impressive endeavor. But indeed, several hundreds of people, experts all across the world being involved. So congratulations and thanks a lot for willing to share your knowledge and your experiences with us. So this has been extremely helpful and meaningful. We have some minutes for some questions and answers. So if you would have a question for the speakers, don't hesitate to type them directly in the chat or raise your hand to ask the floor. And I see that Dietrich Plus has asked the floor. So Dietrich, feel free to go ahead.
Yes, Frank and colleagues, thank you very much for this very impressive results and all the outputs that you produced. I was wondering a bit, because you said that you use, for most of the outcome pairs, you used the population attributable fraction from the global burden of disease study from the IHME. And for the two additional, for the long working hours, which were like with very impressive results, so a very huge burden of disease, you used your own based on your meta-analyses. So my question here is, of course, you did an evidence rating for your two additional pairs. How does it compare with the evidence rating from the IHME? Because it could be a little bit different. So the evidence levels could be different between the two that you used and the remaining risk factors coming from the IHME.
I'd be happy to answer that, unless maybe Halem and Bernadette and Natalie, you want to also comment. Well, these established pairs, WHO and specifically has, as you know, the burden of disease study was established at the World Health Organization together with Harvard and the World Bank. So these pairs are basically, these population attributable fractions are based on reviews that were done in the past and often still from the WHO initial stages of when they were produced. So to us, for WHO in the past, and actually for ILO, from what I understand as well, these have always been continue to be used, right? WHO has a collaboration agreement with IHME, and so there's this collaboration ongoing. And how they compare in terms of their quality of evidence rating is difficult to say. So I appreciate your question, because of course we have done this very thorough process, which took us 5 years of work, right, with these several hundred experts to get to these quality of evidence ratings, and then ultimately a strength of evidence rating, which I think in most systematic reviews in the past was not even used, right? So we have something very new here. So it's difficult to say how this compares to these established peers, and I think science has moved on, and I hope we've sort of been able to contribute a little bit to systematic reviews for burden of disease. I think all of you who conduct who produce these estimates, you'll be probably quite interested in these, I hope. I think it's sort of a new stream, and we're excited to have been able to produce even new methods on systematic reviews on how this is best done. One last comment is that for the first time, we've used a systematic review framework that's specific for basically assessing systematically all steps of an evidence review. So a real systematic review framework, that's called the navigation guide. It's relatively new, but it's tailored to systematic reviews in environmental and occupational health. And this basically has helped us be a framework to go through every single step, including through to strength of evidence assessment. So we hope we've made a scientific contribution to that end. And therewith, maybe other colleagues want to comment also. Halim, Natalie, Balint. Or if not, we could move on to the next question, if that answered your question.
Yes, definitely. And I like your very transparent approach, which is probably more transparent than for the other remaining population attributable fractions and the evidence behind them. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We have another hand raised from Carlo. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. One of the issue of long working hours, at least in high-income countries, is related or largely restricted to self-employed workers because these are less protected and tend really to work with undefined time. I wonder whether you can try to subdivide the employed workers and self-employed workers. And I don't know how the situation is in middle and low income countries. And thank you again for the seminar. It was very interesting.
Okay, maybe I take this one for the databases. That's right that the definition of working hours might depend from country to region, also industries. The data source we used, they are probabilistic surveys. So basically these are self-reports of the persons working. They are not the paycheck reports of companies filing to the authorities. So in that sense, the self-employed or all kind of peculiar workers, they are covered in the database because the response we are using to assess the working hour is that how many hours you as a person were working or usually working, and it's independent of you have a contract for it or it's in somewhere in the informal economy. So in that sense, these are all covered. Difficulty could be that as these are self-reported responses and persons' memories or what they consider work or not, that might be different from person to person. But this is the National Labor Force surveys. First, they try to harmonize the responses we receive, but there is still could be some discrepancy between countries and regions on this regard. Thank you.
There is no quantification of work. It's just self-reported overwork. It's not quantified in terms of hours per week.
It is self-reported in terms of hours per week, but it's not quantified in a sense that it's not counter-checked with the corresponding paycheck hours.
Thank you again.
Okay, thanks. It's 2 p.m. Central European time, which means that we are at the end of the 1 hour time slot. If any of you would have any further questions, I suggest you can contact the colleagues directly. First, of course, have a look at the impressive amount of documentation and outputs that they have been generating. So thanks a lot for the effort that you have been and continue to put in this. So if there are indeed no burning questions at this moment, I suggest we can conclude this session. I want to thank you all once again for being here, and of course a very special word of thanks to our different speakers for the great overview of the work that they have done and continue to do. So thank you all very much for today's webinar, and I wish you all a very nice afternoon and a nice rest of the week. Enjoy the sunshine if you are able to. Don't work too long, and stay safe. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.